The morning Henry Voss died, the birds were singing. Ruth Aldine Voss noticed that first. Before the stillness of the bedroom settled into something permanent, before the realization moved from her chest into her hands and made them shake, before any of it, the birds outside the window of their small house on Clover Hill Road were carrying on the way they always did on a Tuesday morning in early October, completely indifferent to the fact that the man who had shared her bed for 68 years had just drawn his last breath sometime in the pale gray hour before sunrise. She sat beside him for a long time, not crying, not moving, just sitting in the wooden chair she had pulled to his bedside 3 weeks earlier, when the hospice nurse gently suggested that the time for trips back and forth between rooms was probably coming to an end. The chair had left two small indentations in the carpet. Ruth had noticed them the week before and thought she ought to move the chair before the marks became permanent. She never did. And now, looking at those two shallow grooves pressed into the faded beige carpet, she understood that permanent was no longer something she needed to worry about. Henry's hand was still warm when she finally reached for it. That was the thing nobody told you. After 68 years of marriage, after every conversation about growing old together and what the end might look like, nobody had ever mentioned that the hand would still feel warm, that the warmth would trick some small desperate part of you into thinking that if you just held on tightly enough, if you just sat still enough and breathed quietly enough, the whole terrible thing might reverse itself. That he might simply open his eyes and ask what time it was, the way he did every single morning of their life together, always slightly confused, always reaching first for his glasses on the nightstand before anything else. His glasses were still there. Ruth looked at them for a long time. Wire rim slightly bent on the left side from the afternoon 2 summers ago when he'd sat on them in the garden and spent 20 minutes insisting they were perfectly straight, while she tried not to laugh. She had taken them to the optician in town and had the frame adjusted, and he had worn them every day since without once acknowledging that she'd fixed them. That was Henry. He accepted help the way he accepted most things, quietly, without ceremony, as if kindness was simply the natural weather of the world and required no particular comment. She did not cry that morning. She had cried the night before when his breathing had changed, and the hospice nurse had taken her hand in the hallway and spoken in the careful, measured tone of someone who has delivered this particular news many times and has learned that gentleness is the only tool that matters. Ruth had cried then, standing in her own hallway in her housecoat at 2 in the morning, crying in a way she hadn't since their son had died. Years before, a grief so total, it didn't feel like sadness so much as a restructuring of the world itself. A sudden shift in the fundamental architecture of what was real. By morning, she had no tears left. She called Pastor Gregory at 7. He answered on the second ring, which told her he had been awake, possibly waiting. He was a decent man, Pastor Gregory, careful with his words in the way that only people who have sat beside a great many deathbeds ever learn to be. He expressed his condolences with quiet sincerity, asked about arrangements, and then, after a brief pause that Ruth understood immediately, he mentioned the service. "I've reached out to the congregation," he said gently. "Given the circumstances, with so many folks having moved away or passed on themselves, I want you to be prepared that the attendance may be small." Ruth said she understood. "We've had 3 confirmations so far," he continued. "Myself and Patricia, of course. And Doris Hensley said she'll come if her daughter can drive her." Doris Hensley was 84 years old and walked with 2 canes. Ruth thanked him, told him 10 o'clock on Thursday would be fine, and set the phone down on the kitchen table. Then she sat very still in the kitchen chair and looked at the coffee maker on the counter, the one Henry had purchased 17 years ago, despite her insistence that their old percolator worked perfectly well, and which had in fact proven to be so reliable and consistent that she had never once in 17 years admitted out loud that he had been right to buy it. 3 people. She and Henry had attended Oak Ridge Baptist Church for 41 years. They had brought casseroles to sick neighbors, sat in the back pew during other people's sorrows, watched the congregation grow, and then slowly over the decades begin to thin. Friends had moved to be near their children. Others had passed. Some had simply drifted in the quiet way that people drift when age makes travel difficult, and the world shrinks down to the radius of what is manageable. 3 people. Ruth stood up from the kitchen chair, went to the bedroom, and spent a deliberate and careful 45 minutes getting dressed. She chose the pale blue wool coat first, the one Henry had bought her for their 45th anniversary. The one he always said made her look like the prettiest woman in all of Kentucky. She hadn't worn it in 2 years because the winters recently had not been cold enough to justify it. But this morning was cool and gray, and it seemed important in a way she could not entirely explain to wear something that carried his opinion in its fabric. She pinned her hair. She found her good earrings. She picked up the wooden cane that had belonged to Henry in his last months, and that she had quietly begun to rely on without ever announcing the fact. Because there are dignities you maintain not for other people, but for yourself. And Ruth Aldain Voss had maintained most of hers across 9 decades through sheer quiet insistence. She called the taxi service at 8:15. Lena's diner sat at the edge of Route 9, just past the grain co-op and the old barbershop that had changed hands 3 times in the last decade. It was the kind of place that had existed in one form or another on that particular corner for so long that most people in Millhaven could not remember a time when it wasn't there. The booths were vinyl, dark red, cracked in places, and patched with tape that had been there so long it had become part of the original design. The coffee was strong, and the pie was genuine, and the windows were large enough that you could watch the parking lot and the stretch of highway beyond it, without appearing to be watching anything at all. Ruth and Henry had come here every Sunday for the better part of 4 decades. Not always for the food, though the food was good, but because Sunday mornings at Lena's had become over the years one of those small rituals that quietly become the architecture of a life together. Henry always ordered the same thing: 2 eggs, scrambled, wheat toast, black coffee. Ruth varied her order based on principle. The principle being that a person ought to maintain at least the possibility of spontaneity. Henry found this genuinely amusing and never failed to mention it when she ordered something different, and it turned out to be good, and never said a word when it turned out to be less than she had hoped. She had not planned to come here today. She had asked the taxi driver to take her to the pharmacy on Birchwood, where she needed to pick up paperwork related to Henry's prescriptions, a bureaucratic task that grief does not pause to accommodate. But when the taxi turned onto Route 9 and the familiar shape of Lena's appeared on the right side of the road, Ruth heard herself say, before she had consciously decided anything, "Actually, could you stop here first? I won't be long." The taxi driver, a young man of about 30 with a kind face and no particular curiosity about the reasons elderly women made unexpected decisions, pulled into the lot without comment. Ruth pushed open the door. The bell above it jingled the same bell she was fairly certain that had been hanging there since the late 1980s. The smell hit her immediately: coffee, bacon, grease, warm pastry, the particular combination that her memory had filed under Sunday mornings. And Henry's voice and the way the light used to fall across the table by the window on winter mornings. She nearly turned around. Instead, she walked to the counter, settled onto a stool with the careful deliberateness of someone navigating a body that requires more negotiation than it once did, set her cane against the counter's edge and asked for a cup of coffee from the young woman behind the counter, who introduced herself as Becca and brought it in under 2 minutes, which Ruth noted approvingly. The diner was not crowded. A pair of men in work clothes sat at a table near the back speaking quietly over plates of eggs. An older woman Ruth didn't recognize sat near the door reading something on a small phone. And at the large corner booth, the one that could seat 6, sat 4 people whose presence Ruth had noticed when she walked in without fully processing what she was seeing. 4 motorcycles in the parking lot. Large ones, their chrome catching what little gray light the October sky was offering. She had registered them when the taxi pulled in, but had not thought particularly about them. Now she looked at the people who belonged to those motorcycles. They wore leather vests over long-sleeve shirts, the vests covered in patches and insignia that Ruth did not know how to read, but understood to represent membership in something. A group, a brotherhood of some kind, a shared identity worn on the outside of the body, the way some people wore their faith or their history. The largest of the four was a man who sat with his back to the wall, which Ruth recognized from Henry's old westerns, as the seat a man chooses when he is used to being aware of his surroundings. He had a gray threaded beard, and the kind of stillness about him that does not come from ease but from long practice, the stillness of someone who has learned at some cost to be very quiet inside himself. Beside him sat a young man, perhaps mid-twenties, with restless hands and the barely contained energy of someone who experiences sitting still as a mild form of suffering. Across from them, a woman in her late 30s with close-cropped hair and a calm, watchful expression. And at the end of the booth, a heavy-set man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a cup of coffee he kept turning in slow circles without drinking. Ruth looked at them for perhaps 3 seconds. Then she looked back at her own coffee. She had not come in here for any particular reason. She had come in because the alternative was going directly to a pharmacy to collect paperwork about a dead man's prescriptions. And something in her had simply needed 5 minutes in a place where Henry had once been happy. That was all. She drank her coffee. Becca came back and asked if she wanted anything else, and Ruth said no thank you and meant it. She had her coffee. She had 5 minutes. She would drink it slowly and then go do what needed to be done, and then go home and sit in the kitchen and figure out how a person was supposed to occupy the hours between now and Thursday morning. 3 people. The thought returned, without announcement, the way thoughts do when they have real weight behind them. 3 people in a church that seated 200. Henry, who had never in 68 years done anything that required an audience, who had fixed radios in his garage and grown tomatoes badly in the backyard and hummed Tennessee waltz while mowing the lawn. Henry deserved more than 3 people. Not because Henry needed it. Henry was past needing anything. But because a life was a real thing. Because 68 years of showing up quietly and steadily for another person was a real thing. Because the bent glasses on the nightstand and the 2 indentations in the carpet and the coffee maker he had been right about were all real things, and real things deserved witnesses. Ruth set her coffee cup down. And then she was never entirely sure afterward how to explain what happened next, except that grief does strange things to the internal mechanisms that normally govern what a person will and will not do. Her eyes filled with tears, not gradually, not with any warning. One moment she was sitting at the counter with a perfectly composed face, and the next moment the tears were simply there, spilling over before she could decide whether to allow them. She turned her face away from the room, reached into her coat pocket for the folded tissue she always kept there, pressed it carefully against the corners of her eyes with the precision of a woman who has spent 91 years understanding that composure once lost is difficult to recover in public. She was not fast enough. "Excuse me, ma'am." The voice came from her left. She turned slightly to find the young man from the corner booth standing 2 feet away, his hands in his jacket pockets, and his expression carrying the particular combination of concern and uncertainty that young people display when they encounter an older person in distress, and are not sure whether helping will be welcomed or considered an intrusion. He had dark eyes and an earnest face, and a small scar above his left eyebrow that suggested a history of not always thinking before moving. He looked, Ruth thought, like someone's son. He looked like someone who had learned most of what he knew about the world from experience rather than instruction. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Can I get you anything?" Ruth looked at him for a moment. Garrett Winslow, though she did not know his name yet, stood very still while she considered her answer, which she noted with approval. Young people who ask questions and then immediately start filling the silence before the answer arrives have not yet learned the most important thing about listening. "I'm fine," she said. Then, because that was not quite true, and she had spent too many decades being precise about things that mattered to abandon the habit now. I'm not fine, actually, but I don't require anything. Garrett nodded slowly. Okay, he said. He did not leave. My husband passed away, Ruth said, and heard how plain the words sounded, how inadequate, how completely insufficient to describe the restructuring of the world she had experienced that morning in the quiet bedroom while the birds sang outside the window. Yesterday, I'm sorry, I didn't intend to make a scene. You're not making a scene, Garrett said. And then, because he was 24 and had not yet learned to be economical with honesty, you're just sitting at the counter crying, which is pretty reasonable considering. Despite everything, Ruth almost smiled. She became aware then that the large corner booth had gone quiet. She did not turn to look, but she felt the quality of the silence, attentive, not indifferent. I should go, she said, reaching for her cane. You don't have to. This voice came from further away, deeper and quieter than Garrett's. Ruth turned. The large man with the grey threaded beard had not moved from his seat. He had not stood up or crossed the room. He spoke from where he was unhurried, as though the distance between them was not a problem that required solving by anyone other than Ruth herself. There's no rush here, he said. You're welcome to sit. Ruth looked at him for a long moment. Dean Briggs, though she did not yet know his name or anything about him, met her eyes with the steady, uncomplicated gaze of a man who has been in enough serious situations to understand that serious situations require patience above all else. His hands were flat on the table. His coffee was in front of him. He was simply present in the way that very few people manage to be simply present without agenda or performance. Ruth made a decision. She picked up a coffee cup, turned on the counter stool, and with the deliberate, unhurried dignity of a woman who has earned the right to take her time with everything, she walked across the diner and settled into the empty chair at the end of the large corner booth. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Becca appeared, refilled Ruth's cup without being asked, and disappeared again with the professional discretion of someone who understands that some conversations require their own weather. My name is Ruth Voss, she said. Dean Briggs, said the large man. He gestured briefly around the table. Garrett, you've met. That's Sandra, and that's Harlan. The woman with close-cropped hair nodded once. The heavy-set man with the reading glasses pushed up on his forehead said, Harlan Dietz, in a voice like gravel settling, and offered a brief, serious nod. You're traveling through? Ruth asked. It was not quite a question. Heading north, Dean said. Stopped for the night. We try not to ride after dark if we can help it. He paused. How long were you married? 68 years, Ruth said. Garrett made a sound that was not quite words but communicated something genuine. Sandra looked down at the table briefly, and then back up with an expression that Ruth found difficult to read, but recognized as the expression of someone carrying their own quiet weight. We met at a church social in 1956, Ruth said, surprising herself. She had not intended to say anything beyond the number, but the words were there, and the table felt like a place where words could be said without being analyzed. He stepped on my foot during a square dance and then apologized for 11 minutes. I thought he was either extraordinarily clumsy or extraordinarily interested in me. Which was it? Garrett asked. Both, Ruth said, in roughly equal measure as it turned out. The table was quiet for a moment in the way that tables go quiet when something true has been said. Then Ruth set down her coffee cup and looked at her hands. The knuckles were enlarged with age, the skin thin in the way that skin becomes when it has covered 8 decades of living. Henry had held these hands across dinner tables and in hospital waiting rooms and on the front porch on summer evenings when neither of them had anything particular to say, but the silence felt like a kind of conversation. The funeral is Thursday morning, she said. 10 o'clock at Oak Ridge Baptist. She kept her eyes on her hands. The pastor tells me there will be 3 people, myself himself and an 84-year-old woman who will need someone to drive her. Nobody spoke. Henry was not a man who required attention, she continued, and her voice was steady in the way that a voice can be steady when it is working very hard to remain so. He fixed radios in the garage and grew tomatoes badly and hummed old songs while he mowed the lawn. He wasn't famous. He wasn't remarkable in any way that the wider world would have noticed. She paused. But he was remarkable in the ways that matter, in the ways that take 68 years to fully understand. She looked up then, not at any of them in particular, at the middle distance, at something that wasn't in the room. I just need someone there, she said. Not for me, for him, so that the room isn't empty, so that someone can. She stopped, started again, so that his life has witnesses, that's all. The words landed in the silence of the diner. The refrigerator hummed. From the kitchen came the distant sound of a plate being set down. Outside on Route 9, a truck moved past the window without slowing. Ruth reached for her cane. She had said what she had come to say, though she had not known when she walked in that she had come to say it. She had not planned the tears or the young man's kind question, or this corner booth, or these 4 people in leather vests who had listened without interrupting or looking at their phones, which Ruth considered one of the more impressive things about them. She began to rise. What was his name? Dean's voice. Quiet. Not commanding, but with a weight that made the question feel important. Ruth settled back. Henry, she said. Henry Voss. Something moved across Dean Briggs's face. It was not a large movement. It was the kind of thing you would miss if you were not paying close attention, or if you did not have 91 years of practice reading the small expressions that people make when the ordinary sequence of a conversation is interrupted by something unexpected. A fractional stillness, a slight recalibration behind the eyes, as though a name had touched something that did not expect to be touched. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, Mrs. Voss. His voice carried the same quiet steadiness it had held throughout the conversation. But underneath it now, there was something else, something Ruth felt more than heard. I want you to know that your husband will not have an empty room on Thursday. Ruth looked at him. You mean the 4 of you? She asked, and was surprised to find that the thought alone, 4 strangers showing up in leather vests for a man they had never met, was enough to make her throat tighten again. Dean did not answer that question directly. He simply said, he won't be alone. Ruth studied his face for a moment longer. Then she nodded once with the quiet acceptance of a woman who has learned to recognize when a thing is settled. She rose carefully, steadied herself with the cane, and buttoned the top button of the pale blue coat. Thank you for the company, she said. To all of them, but her eyes were on Dean. She crossed the diner. The bell above the door jingled when she pushed it open. Outside, the taxi was still waiting, and the October air was cool and clean and smelled of dried leaves and coming rain. She did not look back. Inside the diner, the corner booth was silent for a moment. Garrett was the first to speak. You know that name, he said. It was not a question. Dean was looking at the door, at the space where Ruth Voss had passed through it, and was now moving carefully down the 2 steps to the parking lot, her blue coat catching the gray morning light. Yeah, he said. I know that name. Harlan Dietz leaned forward slightly, turning his coffee cup in those slow circles again. Sandra said nothing. Watching Dean with the careful attention of someone who has ridden enough miles beside a person to understand when something real is happening underneath the surface of what's being said. You going to tell us? Garrett asked. Dean picked up his phone. He opened the messaging application that connected him to every chapter of the Iron Road Motorcycle Brotherhood. Across 6 states, 47 chapters, several hundred riders. Men and women distributed across the long highways between Texas and the Great Lakes, who share 2 things in common: a love of the road and a belief arrived at through different routes and different histories, but landing in the same place, that loyalty and respect were not abstract values, but practical ones enacted in real situations on real days. He began to type. The message was short. That was intentional. Dean Briggs had learned a long time ago that the messages that traveled furthest were not the complicated ones. His message read, 91-year-old widow in Millhaven, Kentucky. Husband's funeral Thursday morning, 10 a.m. Oak Ridge Baptist Church. She walked into a diner today and told a stranger she just needs someone there. Her husband's name was Henry Voss. I know that name. I'll explain when I see you. Right now, I'm asking who's within riding distance. He set the phone face up on the table. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the first reply arrived. Then another. Then 5 more. In the span of time it took Garrett to read the message over Dean's shoulder and look up with an expression that was equal parts surprise and recognition. Recognition of something he hadn't known he was capable of feeling until this particular Tuesday morning in a diner on Route 9 in Millhaven, Kentucky. The replies came fast and kept coming. Send the address. How many do you need? I'm 2 hours out. Rolling now. I'll call Birdwell. He's in Lexington. He'll want to know. Who is Henry Voss? This last message came from a number Dean recognized as belonging to a rider named Stu Calhoun out of Bowling Green. A methodical, careful man who always asked the question everyone else was already thinking. Dean typed back, a man who deserves witnesses. That's enough for now. Garrett read this over Dean's shoulder and was quiet for a moment. Then he said very quietly, she doesn't know any of this is happening, does she? No, Dean said. Outside through the large diner window, Ruth Voss was lowering herself carefully into the back seat of the waiting taxi. The driver held the door. She moved with the deliberate, unhurried dignity that Dean had noticed immediately. When she first walked in, the dignity of someone who has stopped pretending that any of it is easy and has decided instead to do it beautifully. The taxi door closed. Dean watched it pull out of the lot and turn south on Route 9, the pale blue of Ruth's coat briefly visible through the rear window before the car moved beyond the angle of the glass. He looked back down at his phone. The replies were coming faster now. The number of riders confirming was climbing past 15 past 20. Someone had forwarded the message to a chapter in Tennessee. Someone else had passed it to a group in southern Ohio. Sandra, who had been quiet throughout, finally spoke. What's the story with the name? She asked. Henry Voss. You went somewhere when she said it. Dean set the phone down, looked at the table. He was not a man who spoke about personal things easily or often, and the people who rode with him had learned to recognize the particular quality of his silences, which ones were simply the natural pauses of a man who thought before speaking, and which ones meant something more. This was one of the ones that meant something more. My father, he said finally, used to tell a story about a night in 1987. He was working a job in Nashville, warehouse work, nothing special. There was a fire, equipment malfunction, some kind of electrical fault. He was inside when it started. Nobody moved. He made it out, Dean continued. But not on his own. Someone went back in, pulled him through a section of the building that was already. He stopped, started again. He never found out who the man was. Gone before the paramedics arrived. Didn't wait to be thanked. Just disappeared. Garrett was very still. My father described him the same way every single time he told that story, Dean said. Quiet, ordinary looking, wearing a flannel work shirt, blue plaid. And he said. Dean paused again, and this pause was different from the others, weighted differently, held differently. He said the man hummed something while he was pulling him out. Couldn't make out the song, just humming, like it was the most natural thing in the world. The diner was very quiet. I don't know for certain, Dean said. I don't have any proof. It's a name and a description, and 37 years of my father wondering about a man he never got to thank. He picked up his phone. The notification count had climbed to 31. But Ruth Voss said her husband fixed things quietly and never needed anyone to notice. And I know that name. Harlan Dietz picked up his coffee finally and drank from it slowly. Then he set it down and nodded once with the gravity of a man who has measured something and found it to be exactly what it appeared to be. Then we'd better make sure he has witnesses, he said. Outside on Route 9, the October sky had lowered and darkened slightly with the suggestion of coming rain. The four motorcycles sat in the lot, their chrome dulled now under the clouds. Somewhere south of town, a taxi was carrying a 91-year-old woman in a pale blue coat toward a pharmacy, and then home to a house that contained two small indentations in the carpet, and a pair of bent wire-rimmed glasses on a nightstand, and a coffee maker that had been the right choice all along. She did not know what had just been set in motion. The taxi dropped Ruth off at the pharmacy on Birchwood at 10:30. She collected the paperwork, signed 3 forms, answered questions from a young pharmacist who spoke to her in the careful, slightly elevated volume that some young people default to when addressing the elderly, as though age were a form of distance that could be closed by speaking louder. Ruth answered each question in her normal voice at her normal volume, and the pharmacist eventually adjusted without being asked. The paperwork took 20 minutes. It concerned prescription renewals that would no longer be needed, insurance notifications that needed to be filed, a bureaucratic reckoning with the fact that Henry Voss had existed as a patient in various systems and databases, and those systems now required updating to reflect his absence. Ruth filled out each form with the same careful precision she brought to everything. The same handwriting she had used for 68 years, the same deliberate pressure on the pen, the same habit of reading each line twice before committing to an answer. She thought about the diner on the taxi ride home, not with regret. She had walked into a diner and drunk a cup of coffee, and at some point between sitting down and standing up, told 4 strangers the truth about Thursday morning. She could not fully explain why she had done it, except that grief has its own logic separate from the logic of ordinary days, and sometimes that logic leads a person somewhere unexpected and turns out upon reflection to have been correct. The large man Dean had said Henry would not be alone. She held that sentence carefully aware of its weight, not entirely certain whether it could bear close examination. 4 people, perhaps, if they kept their word. She had no way of knowing. She had not thought to ask for a phone number or a last name or any of the ordinary mechanisms by which people confirmed intentions. She had simply believed him. That was the word for it. She had looked at the face of a man she had never met and believed what he said the way you believe weather coming in from the west or the sound of a voice in the dark that you recognize as trustworthy, before you can explain why. The taxi pulled up to the house on Clover Hill Road. Ruth paid the driver, thanked him, and climbed the 3 porch steps one at a time with the Kane's assistance. She unlocked the front door, the lock that Henry had replaced 4 years ago with a sturdier deadbolt, after reading something concerning in the newspaper, a task he had accomplished over the course of an entire Saturday, with considerable commentary about the previous lock's inadequacies. Inside the house was exactly as she had left it. Of course it was. Houses do not rearrange themselves in response to loss. The furniture stays where it has always been. The photographs on the mantelpiece continue to hold the faces they have always held. The kitchen smells of the coffee brewed that morning and the faint underlying scent of the house itself. Wood and old books and something that Ruth could not name, but had always associated with the particular quality of light through the east window in the afternoon. She hung up the blue coat on the hook by the door. Henry's hook was beside it. Empty his brown canvas jacket, gone to the hospice donation pile 3 days ago, a practical decision she had made quickly, because she understood that some practical decisions need to be made before the emotions have time to organize opposition. She went to the kitchen, made tea, sat in her chair at the table, not Henry's chair, the one perpendicular to it, the one she had always occupied, and looked at the wall and drank her tea slowly, and did not look at the empty chair across from her. After a while, she went to the bedroom, not to rest, but because there were practical matters there that required her attention. The room was nearly itself again, nearly the room it had been before the illness had made it into something more clinical than a bedroom ought to be. The chair with the two indentations was still there. The glasses were still on the nightstand. Ruth sat on the edge of the bed. She looked at the nightstand, at the glasses, at the small stack of things beside them. A library book. Henry would not finish a notepad with a grocery list in his slightly trembling handwriting, and a folded piece of paper she had not noticed before. She reached for the folded paper. It was not sealed, not addressed, just folded twice as though it had been set there for a later, placed among the ordinary objects of daily life, the way important things sometimes are not hidden, just waiting. She unfolded it. The handwriting was Henry's, more unsteady than it once had been. The tremor had worsened over the last 2 years. But unmistakably his the same cramped, left-leaning script she had been reading for 6.5 decades. It was a list, not a grocery list, not a to-do list. It was a list of names, dates, and brief notations. 13 entries spanning decades, the earliest dated 1971, the most recent 2019. Each entry consisted of a name, a year, and 2 or 3 words. Aldrich Roy, 1971, roof after storm. Parnell. Linda, 1978, grocery 6 weeks. Garrett family, 1985, truck repair. McIntyre. Deb, 1993, school supplies, both kids. The list continued down the page in Henry's careful shaking hand. Small things, practical things. A roof repaired after a storm. Groceries delivered quietly to a family that would not have asked. A truck repaired for no payment. School supplies for children whose parents were navigating something that made school supplies temporarily impossible. Not dramatic, not heroic, just steady, continuous. The kind of help that arrives without announcement and disappears without requiring gratitude. Ruth read the list twice. Then she sat with it in her hands for a long time. She had known Henry for 68 years. She had known his habits and his preferences and his opinions on most subjects. She had known about the radios he fixed for neighbors and the lawn he mowed badly and the tomatoes that never quite produced what he hoped. She had known about the coffee maker and the bent glasses and the anniversary he never forgot. She had not known about this list. Or rather, she had known in the way you know things that are demonstrated rather than spoken. She had known he was the kind of man who helped people without mentioning it. She simply had not known the extent of it, the quiet consistency of it across 50 years. The fact that he had kept a record not for credit, but perhaps simply because these people had mattered to him. Because the record was his private acknowledgement that their difficulty had been real, and his help, however small, had been a real response to a real need. Henry Voss, who had never once in their marriage asked to be recognized for anything. Ruth folded the list carefully and placed it in the pocket of her cardigan close to her chest. Then she went to the closet, found the flannel shirt on the third shelf, blue plaid, worn soft with decades of wear, the shirt Henry had owned since before she could remember, and had refused to throw away through 4 separate household declutterings on the grounds that it was still perfectly serviceable, which was true, but not the actual reason he kept it. He had simply loved it, the way people love ordinary objects that have been present across enough years to carry the texture of those years in their fabric. She took the shirt out, folded it neatly, and set it on the chair beside the bed. She would bring it Thursday. She didn't know why. She simply knew she would. At 10 minutes past 8 that evening, Ruth sat at the kitchen table with her journal open in front of her. She had kept a journal for 40 years, a habit she had begun in her early 50s and continued because the practice of writing was clarifying. It forced her to find the actual words for things, rather than leaving them as impressions floating loosely in the mind. And Ruth had always believed that things named precisely could be managed more effectively than things left vague. She wrote, Henry died Tuesday morning. The birds were singing. She wrote, 3 people will come to his funeral. I am one of them. She stopped, looked at the window, which showed her nothing but her own reflection and the darkness of the yard beyond it. She wrote, I walked into Lena's today and told a stranger that I needed someone there. I don't know why. I think Henry would have laughed at me. He would have said something like, Ruthie, you walked up to a man the size of a barn and told him your business. And I would have said, he had a kind face. And Henry would have said, I have a kind face. And I would have said, you have a familiar face which is different. And he would have laughed, and that would have been the end of it. She set down the pen. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed its steady, untroubled hum. En route 9, half a mile away, a truck moved through the darkness, its engine rising and fading. And then the night was quiet again. Ruth sat in the quiet and let it be what it was. She did not know that at almost the same moment in the parking lot of the Millhaven Motor Inn, 4 blocks south of Lena's diner, Dean Briggs was sitting on the low concrete wall beside his motorcycle with his phone in his hand, watching the reply count climb past 60. He had been watching it climb for most of the afternoon. He had expected a response. The Iron Road Brotherhood did not ignore each other's messages, and the message he had sent was the kind that carries its own momentum. But the speed of it, the sheer volume, had exceeded even his expectation. Riders from Lexington, from Louisville, from Nashville and Bowling Green, and a chapter in Eastern Tennessee that Dean had only met twice in person. Someone from Indianapolis, someone else from Columbus who said they were forwarding it to a group in Cleveland. The message had moved beyond the Iron Road network, entirely forwarded through connections he couldn't trace, passed from hand to hand along chains of association that crisscrossed the middle of the country, like invisible lines of obligation, because that was what they were really. Obligation. Not the heavy, resentful kind, the other kind. The kind that feels like the simplest and most natural response to a clear and genuine need. His phone buzzed with a specific notification. He read the message. My name is Everett Webb. I live in Millhaven on Decker Road, 3 blocks from Oak Ridge Baptist. I'm not a member of any club. I'm a retired electrician, 62 years old. But Henry Voss fixed my father's hearing aid in 2003 when my father had nothing. Took it apart on his workbench, ordered a part, spent a whole Saturday on it, and refused every dollar my father tried to hand him. My father talked about that for years. He passed in 2017. I don't know how to ride a motorcycle, but if there's a place for a man in a truck, I'd like to come. Dean read the message twice. Then he typed back, Everett, you don't need to be a member of anything. You just need to show up. There will be a place for you. He sat for a moment after sending it, looking at the name. Henry Voss, who fixed a stranger's hearing aid on a Saturday in 2003. Henry Voss, who kept a list of small kindnesses in a nightstand drawer. Henry Voss, who, if Dean's understanding of an old story was correct, had walked into a burning building in Nashville in 1987 and pulled a man out and walked away without leaving a name. The reply count passed 80. Dean called his father at 8:45. His father, Raymond Briggs, was 81 years old and lived alone in a small house outside Cookeville, Tennessee. Dean called him every 2 weeks regular, as anything, conversations that covered practical matters. The house, the truck, the neighbor who plowed the driveway in winter, and occasionally, briefly, other things. They had not been easy with each other when Dean was young. Raymond Briggs had been a hard man in the way that some men of his generation were hard, not cruel, not absent, but armored in a way that made certain kinds of conversation difficult. Dean had spent most of his 20s resenting this, his 30s understanding it, his 40s arriving slowly at something that was not quite forgiveness, because forgiveness implies a wrong that needed correcting. And Dean had come to believe that his father's armor had been constructed from necessity rather than choice, and had simply never been fully dismantled when the necessity passed. The phone rang 3 times. Dean. His father's voice was thinner than it once had been, but recognizable still, carrying the particular cadence of a man who meant what he said. and considered unnecessary words a form of waste. Dad. Dean looked up at the sky above the motel parking lot. Stars were coming out over the eastern edge. I'm in Millhaven, Kentucky. I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to just listen for a minute. A brief pause. All right. Dean told him about Ruth, about Lena's diner, and the pale blue coat, and the way she had said, I just need someone there, without self-pity, without performance, with the flat, honest simplicity of a woman who had lived long enough to know that the truth plainly spoken was the only currency worth spending. Then he said, she told me her husband's name, Dad. She said his name was Henry Voss. The silence on the line was different from the ordinary pauses in their conversations. Dean. His father's voice was very quiet. I know, Dean said. I can't be certain, but I know his name, and she said he was a man who fixed things quietly and never needed anyone to notice. And I know what you told me about the flannel shirt and the humming. Another silence. Longer. Then Raymond Briggs said in a voice that was not quite steady, you go. You make sure that man has witnesses. I will, Dean said. And Dean. His father paused, and in the pause was something that had never been said directly, had lived instead in the gaps between practical conversations and the regular phone calls. Your mother would have said the same thing. Dean was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. I know she would have. He ended the call and sat with the phone in his hand looking at the stars over Millhaven, thinking about the particular way that time works, how it folds, how a moment from 1987 could reach forward through 37 years and land in a corner booth on a Tuesday morning with enough force to set hundreds of people in motion. Garrett Winslow called his mother at 9:15. He had been riding for 4 years with the Iron Road Brotherhood, which meant he had been riding since he was 20 and had spent most of those 4 years learning the difference between the version of himself that existed before the road and the one that was being made by it. He had grown up in Harlan County, 2 hours east of Millhaven, in a household that had contained his mother, his grandmother, and a notable absence where a father was supposed to be. His father had left when Garrett was 7, not dramatically, not with a scene, but with a gradual decrease in presence over several months, until one day the presence was simply gone. His grandmother had died when he was 9. He had not been taken to the funeral. His mother decided he was too young, but he had grown up carrying the specific unresolved weight of a grief that had no ceremony attached to it. No room to stand in, no occasion to say goodbye. He did not connect this consciously to the reason he was riding toward Millhaven through the dark. He did not need to. Hey, Mom. He had the phone on speaker propped against the mirror of his parked bike outside the gas station, where he'd stopped to fill up 40 miles south of town. Garrett. His mother's voice carried the particular combination of relief and studied casualness that mothers deploy when they are glad to hear from their children. Where are you? Heading to Millhaven, a funeral, for a man I never met. A brief pause. Whose funeral? A man named Henry Voss. He was 93. His wife walked into a diner today and said she was afraid no one would come. He paused. So we're going. His mother was quiet for a moment. That poor woman, she said softly. Yeah, Garrett said. You're a good kid, Garrett. He started to deflect this the way he usually did and then stopped. Mom, he said, I never went to Grandma's funeral. I never got to say anything. His mother was very still on the line. I know, she said softly. I think maybe that's part of why I'm going, he said. I think Henry Voss deserves someone who understands what it means for a room to be empty. He heard his mother exhale something quieter than a sigh. You call me when you get there, she said, and when it's over. He put the phone in his pocket, finished fueling the bike, and pulled back onto the highway heading north. The night air was cold and clean, and the road was straight and dark. And Garrett Winslow rode toward Millhaven with the particular feeling of someone moving in the right direction for reasons that are older than the reason they can name. Sandra Elkins did not call anyone. She had driven south after leaving Lena's diner. She had her own errand in a town 40 minutes down Route 9, a thing she had planned before any of this. She drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio of the way she usually drove, which was the way she did most things quietly without explaining herself to anyone, including herself. She received Dean's message at 3:15 in the afternoon, parked outside a hardware store. She read it twice. Then she sat with the phone in her lap for a while and looked through the hardware store window at the rows of tools and the ordinary daylight commerce of a Tuesday afternoon. Sandra Elkins had been riding with the Iron Road Brotherhood for 6 years. She was the only woman in her chapter, a fact she had encountered with equanimity, because equanimity was her primary mode of operation, not because she was indifferent to things, but because she had learned at some cost that the energy spent on being bothered by circumstances beyond your control was energy not spent on everything else. She had lost a daughter. This was not a thing she spoke of, not because it was secret, but because it was hers. It had happened 11 years ago, a baby born in April, who lived for 4 days and was named Clara, and who had been held in those 4 days with the fierce tenderness of someone who understands that time is short and presence is everything. Every funeral since then had carried Clara's weight. Every empty room had been the room where Clara was not. Sandra turned the truck around at 3:23 and drove back north toward Millhaven. She did not explain this to anyone because it did not require explanation. Dean's message had asked a question and her answer was yes, and the reasons were hers to keep. She arrived back at the Millhaven Motor Inn at 6:30, checked in and sat in the room with the television off and the curtains opened to the parking lot where the first bikes were beginning to appear under the yellow light as riders arrived from the highway. She thought about Ruth Voss in a blue coat. She thought about a woman who had walked into a diner and simply told the truth. She thought about how much courage that required, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that announces itself, but the ordinary kind that shows up in small moments when a person could easily say nothing and chooses instead to speak. Clara would have been 11 now. Sandra looked at the parking lot and did not cry because she had done her crying a long time ago. And what remained was not grief exactly, but a permanent tenderness toward the world, a heightened awareness of how much things cost and how rarely the cost is acknowledged. Henry Voss deserved acknowledgement. Ruth Voss deserved to stand in a room full of witnesses. That was all there was to it. In a town outside Bowling Green, a man named Branson pulled on his vest at 11 at night. His wife stood in the kitchen doorway watching him, her arms folded, her expression carrying the specific mixture of concern and resignation that belongs to people who love someone with a long history of answering calls like this one. "Colt," she said, "you had your treatment Wednesday." "I know," he said. "You're supposed to rest." "I know that too." He was 61 years old and had been riding since he was 19 and had received a diagnosis 4 months ago that had reorganized everything about how he thought about the coming year. He was not dramatic about this. He was navigating it the way he navigated most things, 1 mile at a time. "Someone needs us there," he said. He picked up his helmet from the kitchen counter and looked at his wife with the steady look of a man who has thought about this and arrived at a clear position. A woman walked into a diner and said she didn't want her husband buried alone. That's the whole story. His wife looked at him for a long moment. "You call me when you get there," she said, "and you come straight home after." "Yes, ma'am," he said. She crossed the kitchen and kissed him once firmly on the cheek. Then she stepped back and watched him go. By midnight, the number of confirmed riders had passed 140. Dean knew this because he had unmuted his notifications to check and then muted them again. He was sitting on the bed in his motel room boots, still on the room dark except for the glow of the screen. He scrolled through the messages. Riders he had met, riders he hadn't. People who had been passed the message by 3 degrees of connection and had responded anyway because the message was simple and the need was clear. And sometimes that is entirely sufficient. One message near the bottom stopped him. It was from a number he didn't recognize with a local Millhaven area code. My name is Everett Webb. I live on Decker Road. I already sent a message about the hearing aid. I just wanted to say I drove past Oak Ridge Baptist tonight on my way home. It's a small church. It's going to be a good day for that small church. Dean read the message twice. Then he turned off the screen and lay back on the motel bed in the dark and looked at the ceiling. In the morning, riders were going to arrive in Millhaven, Kentucky for a 93-year-old man named Henry Voss, who had fixed things quietly for 50 years and kept a private record of small kindnesses in a nightstand drawer, and Dean believed this could not prove it, but believed it in the particular way you believe things that arrive through the channel of something older than logic had once walked into a burning building and pulled out a stranger and walked away without leaving a name. And none of it would have happened if a 91-year-old woman in a pale blue wool coat had not sat down at a corner booth and simply told the truth. Dean closed his eyes. Outside on Route 9, the first of the distant engines could already be heard low and steady coming in from the south. Then another from the east. The sound of motorcycles approaching Millhaven in the dark one by one, and in small groups converging on a small Kentucky town that had no idea what morning was going to bring. Ruth Aldane Voss sat at her kitchen table and wrote the last line of that night's entry. I think Henry would have been embarrassed. And then when he understood it, I think he would have been very, very glad. She closed the journal. She went to the bedroom and lay down without sleeping, and looked at the ceiling and listened to the house, which was quiet, which was always going to be quiet from now on, but which felt in this particular night in some way she could not explain, like something was moving toward it, like the world for once was leaning in. The morning of Henry the Voss's funeral arrived the way October mornings arrive in Kentucky, quietly, without announcement, the darkness thinning at its edges first, the hills emerging from the night like things being remembered rather than revealed. Ruth was already awake. She had not slept in any continuous way that could be called sleeping. She had moved in and out of something lighter, a resting wakefulness in which she was aware of the ceiling above her and the pillow beside her, and the quality of the silence in the house, and in which Henry was simultaneously absent, and everywhere in the smell of the room, and the particular creak of the floorboard near the closet, and the way the early light came through the curtains at an angle he had always complained about, and she had always defended, and neither of them had ever changed. She rose at 5:30. She made coffee and stood at the kitchen window while it brewed, and watched the darkness in the yard give way to the gray-blue of early morning. The tomato plants at the far edge of the garden had gone brown and dry at the end of the season. Henry had put them in too late, as he always did, and they had produced exactly 4 tomatoes before the weather turned, as they always did. She had told him every year that he was starting them too late, and every year he had disagreed, and every year the evidence had borne her out, and he had accepted this with the good-natured stubbornness of a man who had decided that the process mattered more than the outcome. She would leave the dead plants until spring. She poured her coffee and took it to the kitchen table and sat in her chair and drank it slowly and thought about the day ahead. There was a sequence to it. The taxi was coming at 9. The service was at 10. Pastor Gregory had told her the church would be ready. Doris Hensley's daughter had confirmed she would bring her mother. 3 people. 4 perhaps if Dean Briggs and his companions kept their word. She dressed with the same deliberateness as 2 days before. The black dress, good shoes, the pearl earrings Henry had given her on their 30th anniversary, bought from a jewelry store in Louisville, where he had driven alone on a Saturday, and returned with the small velvet box tucked inside his jacket pocket, presenting it at dinner with the offhand casualness of a man who was terrible at hiding his own pleasure. She took Henry's flannel shirt from the chair beside the bed, folded it once more carefully, and placed it in her bag alongside the small journal and the list from Henry's drawer. She stood in the bedroom doorway for a moment and looked at the room. The glasses on the nightstand, the indentations in the carpet, the chair that had held her through 3 weeks of vigil. "All right, Henry," she said quietly, not performing it for anyone, just saying it the way you say things to people who are no longer in the room but have not yet entirely stopped being present. "Let's go." The taxi arrived at 8:55. The driver was the same young man as Tuesday. He held the door for her without being asked. She settled in the back seat with her bag on her lap and her cane resting against the door, and watched Clover Hill Road pass by the window as they moved through the quiet streets of early morning Millhaven. The town was still, a Wednesday, people going to work, to school, to the ordinary business of ordinary days. The hardware store on Main opening its shutters, the coffee shop on Birchwood with its small crowd of regulars visible through the glass. The gas station at the corner of Route 9 where a teenager in a yellow vest was sweeping the lot with unhurried strokes. Ruth watched it all with the particular attention of someone who has learned not to take the ordinary for granted. The taxi turned south onto Route 9, and then the driver said quietly, "Huh." Ruth looked up. The sound reached her before the image resolved a low-layered rumble that she felt in the base of her sternum, before she consciously identified it. Not thunder, too steady, too rhythmic. The sound of engines, many of them running at low speed. The sound of something large moving through a small space with unusual care. The driver had slowed. Ruth leaned forward. The road ahead was lined with motorcycles, not 4, not 20. A line of them stretching the length of the block and continuing, dozens upon dozens parked side by side along both curbs of the street that led to Oak Ridge Baptist Church, their chrome catching the thin October morning light, in a way that made the whole street seem to shimmer slightly, as though the ordinary road had been replaced overnight with something from a different order of reality. And between the bikes, standing quietly in the cool morning air, riders. Men and women in leather vests, some with helmets in their hands, some bareheaded, standing in small groups, or alone, all of them facing the same direction, all of them still in the particular way that people are still when they are present with intention rather than simply waiting. The driver stopped the taxi at the edge of the scene, apparently uncertain where to go. Ruth stared. She tried to count and lost count before she reached the end. There were hundreds of motorcycles. There were hundreds of people. They filled the street leading to the church and overflowed the parking area and stood along the fence line and spilled out across the grass of the small lawn that bordered the entrance path. She heard herself say very quietly, "Oh," just that word, just that single syllable that is what the human voice produces when language has not yet caught up to what the eyes are telling it. The driver turned in his seat. He was looking at her with an expression that had moved past confusion into something softer. "Ma'am," he said, "I think these people are here for you." Ruth could not speak for a moment, and then a figure detached itself from the crowd near the church gate. Dean Briggs, moving with the unhurried steadiness she had recognized in Lena's diner 2 days ago. He was carrying his helmet at his side. His expression was serious in the way that serious occasions require, but there was something in his bearing as he approached that communicated welcome as clearly as any smile could have. The driver got out first and opened her door. Ruth stepped out. The morning air was cool and smelled of damp grass and exhaust, and something almost like wood smoke from somewhere down the road. She straightened one hand on the cane, one hand on the door frame, and stood in the street that was lined with hundreds of people who had come to a small Kentucky town for a man they had never met. Dean Briggs stopped 2 feet from her and removed his helmet. "Mrs. Vosso," he said. "Good morning." Ruth looked at him. Then she looked at the street behind him, the long rows of motorcycles and the riders standing beside them, the whole improbable, enormous fact of it stretching away in both directions. "What is this?" she asked. Dean turned slightly, following her gaze down the length of the street. Then he looked back at her. "You said you didn't want Henry to be alone today." Ruth's hand tightened on the cane. She looked at the riders nearest to them. Harlan Deed's reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, standing with the solidity of a man who has decided he's exactly where he is supposed to be. Garrett Winslow, the scar above his eyebrow catching the morning light, looking at her with an expression so earnest and unguarded that it made her want to say something kind to him immediately. Sandra Elkin's close-cropped hair giving a single serious nod when Ruth's eyes found hers. And beyond them, 200 people who had driven through the night to stand in the morning in Millhaven, Kentucky, for a man who had spent his life doing quiet things for other people and keeping no account of it except a private list in a nightstand drawer. Ruth covered her mouth with a free hand. She did not make a sound. She had told herself on the drive over that she would not cry today. But the tears arrived anyway, the way they had in the diner 2 days ago without warning, as though grief and gratitude were using the same channel and could not be managed separately. Dean waited. He did not speak or move to fill the moment. He simply stood and waited in the way that a person waits when they understand that what is happening needs room to happen without being hurried. After a moment, Ruth lowered her hand. She looked at Dean directly. "He would have been embarrassed," she said. Her voice was steady. "And then when he understood it, he would have been very, very glad." Dean held her gaze. "I think you're right," he said. He offered his arm. Ruth looked at it for a moment, this large arm offered with the same uncomplicated directness as everything else about this man. Then she took it. She placed a free hand in the crook of his elbow and felt the solidity of him, the realness of it, and they began to walk. The riders formed the corridor as she moved through the gate. They had arranged themselves in 2 lines on either side of the path, leading from the gate to the church entrance, standing close enough to form an unbroken presence, but leaving the path itself clear. A lane of honor created without instruction. Each person settling into position with the natural understanding of people who know what an occasion requires. Ruth walked slowly. She did not rush. She moved through the corridor at the pace her body required the cane, tapping a steady rhythm on the stone path. And she looked at the faces on either side of her as she passed. She did not look at her shoes or the ground ahead. She looked at the faces. A man in his 60s with a silver beard who placed his hand over his heart as she passed. A younger woman who was crying quietly and didn't seem to notice. A man so large he seemed constructed on a different scale, standing with his helmet pressed against his chest and his head bowed. An older man, thin and slightly unsteady on his feet, who straightened his back when she reached him, as though standing at attention were a thing he was going to do correctly, regardless of what it cost him. And Ruth recognized with a start that this was Branson, though she did not know his name, and that he was here, despite something that had cost him, and that this cost was written clearly in the set of his jaw and the careful way he held himself upright. Ruth passed each one. She passed all of them all the way down the length of that corridor, and the only sound was the tap of her cane on the path, and the quiet of 200 people holding themselves still out of respect for a man who had fixed broken things in a garage and grown tomatoes badly and never once forgotten his anniversary. At the church door, Pastor Gregory was waiting. He was a man who had performed hundreds of services in this building and believed he had encountered most of what a life in ministry could produce by way of surprise. His expression made clear he had been wrong about that. He collected himself, took Ruth's hand in both of his. "Ruth," he said. He did not have any more words immediately. "I know," she said. They went inside. Every pew was full. Ruth stood at the entrance of the nave for a moment and took it in the small church that seated perhaps 180 people. Its pews filled beyond capacity, riders sitting shoulder to shoulder, some standing along the side walls. All of them turned toward the front, where Henry's casket rested beneath a spray of white chrysanthemums. The building smelled of leather and coffee, and the particular old wood and candle smell of a church that has been in continuous use for a century. The morning light came through the stained glass windows on the east wall. and laid colored patterns across the congregation, amber and blue and a deep quiet red that moved slowly across the pews as the sun shifted. Ruth walked to the front pew. She sat. She placed her bag beside her and set Henry's flannel shirt on her lap and looked at his casket. He was in there. That was still a strange thing, that a man who had been so thoroughly present for so long was now contained within a specific wooden structure at the front of a church. It seemed insufficient. It seemed, as it always seems, like the wrong scale for what it was trying to hold. She reached into her bag and found the list, held it folded in her hand. Before the service began, she became aware of someone standing in the aisle beside her pew. She turned. A man she did not know. Medium height, early 60s, with the weathered look of someone who has spent most of his life doing physical work outdoors. He was not wearing a leather vest. He had on a plain dark jacket and work trousers, and the slightly formal air of a man not accustomed to wearing his good clothes on a Wednesday. He held his hat in both hands. "Mrs. Voss," he said quietly, "my name is Everett Webb. I live on Decker Road. I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to tell you that I'm the one who sent the message about the hearing aid. My father's hearing aid." Ruth looked at him. "Henry fixed it," Everett said. 2003. My father had nothing that year. We were going through a real hard time, and his hearing aid was the thing that let him manage his days, and it broke. We couldn't afford the repair shop. Someone told my father to try the man on Clover Hill Road who fixed things. He paused. His hands tightened slightly on the hat. Henry took it apart on his workbench. Spent a whole Saturday. Found the part somewhere, ordered it, paid for it himself. We found that out later. Refused every dollar my father tried to hand him. He stopped. My father talked about that for years, right up until he passed in 2017. Ruth looked at this man for a long moment. She thought about the list in her hand. She thought about all the names on it: Roy Aldrich and Linda Parnell and the Garrett family, and all the others, 13 entries spanning 50 years of quiet help given and never discussed. She thought about Henry at his workbench on a Saturday, taking apart a hearing aid with the careful hands of a man who understood that broken things could be fixed if you were willing to be patient with them. She smiled. It was the first time she had smiled since Henry died, genuinely, fully, without effort. It came from somewhere deeper than expression, from the place where recognition lives. That, she said, sounds exactly like him. He never mentioned it once. Everett Webb blinked rapidly. He nodded once firmly, the nod of a man receiving confirmation of something he had needed confirmed. "No, ma'am," he said. "I didn't think he would." He moved to find a seat. Ruth watched him go. Then she turned back to face the front of the church and looked at Henry's casket and said under her breath, "You and your Saturdays, Henry." Pastor Gregory began at 10 o'clock precisely. His voice carried into the full church with a quality she had not heard in it before, a slight tremble at the edges, not from weakness, but from the weight of the occasion pressing on him from outside his own expected experience. He was a man encountering something larger than what he had prepared for, and he was handling it with the honest grace of someone who does not pretend to have prepared for what is actually happening. He spoke about Henry with sincerity and with the honest acknowledgement that theirs had been the relationship of pastor and parishioner rather than close friends. He spoke about what he had observed across 41 years. A man who sat in the third pew from the back on the left side, who shook hands after service with the straightforward warmth of someone who means it, who always brought Ruth's coat when it was cold, who once spent 3 hours helping fix a broken furnace in the church on a Saturday in February without being asked. Then he turned to Ruth. Ruth stood. She walked to the small lectern at the front of the church, past the casket, and turned to face the congregation. 200 faces looked back at her, faces she did not know, belonging to people who had ridden through the night for reasons she was only beginning to understand. And in the front pew, Everett Webb with his hat in his lap, and Garrett Winslow with his earnest face, and Sandra Elkins with her watchful calm, and Harlan Dietz, and Dean Briggs sitting very still, the blue flannel shirt folded on the pew beside him, where she had set it before walking up. Ruth placed her notes on the lectern and did not use them. Henry Voss was not a remarkable man, she said. He would be the first to tell you that. He fixed old radios in a garage that smelled of solder and machine oil. He grew tomatoes that never amounted to much. He mowed the lawn in a pattern that I found illogical but could never convince him to change. He snored. He forgot where he put his keys approximately 4 times a week for 68 years. She paused. He once set fire to a chicken he was attempting to cook for our 40th anniversary dinner, and he spent the rest of the evening pretending this had been the plan all along. A soft sound moved through the church, not quite laughter, something warmer than laughter. He was also, Ruth continued, and her voice was steady, absolutely steady, the most quietly decent person I have ever known. Not dramatically decent, not in ways that required an audience. He helped people when they needed help, and then he went back to his garage and his radios and his badly performing tomatoes, and he did not mention it again. She looked out at the congregation. I found a list in his nightstand drawer after he died. A private list not for anyone else. Just names and dates and small descriptions of things he had done for people across 50 years. He never showed it to me. He never mentioned it. I have been married to this man for 68 years, and I did not know the full extent of what he was. She stopped for a moment. The church was absolutely silent. I don't say this to make him a saint. He was not a saint. He had opinions about the correct way to load a dishwasher that I disagreed with entirely for 43 years. He was wrong about several things in a persistent and committed way. But he was right about the things that matter most, about showing up, about doing the work in front of you, about not needing anyone to notice. She placed her hand flat on the lectern. I'm going to miss him every day for whatever days I have left. Not because he was famous or remarkable in any way the world outside this room would measure, but because he was present. Because for 68 years through everything he was simply there. And there is nothing in the world I have learned quite as valuable as that. She returned to her seat. The silence lasted several seconds. Then Dean Briggs stood up. He did not move to the lectern. He stood in the pew and spoke from there, which was the right instinct. This was not a prepared speech, and standing at a lectern would have made it one. I want to say something, he said. With your permission, Mrs. Voss. Ruth nodded. Dean looked at the casket, then at the congregation. His voice carried without effort the deep, even voice of a man accustomed to being heard over the sound of engines and wind. My father was a warehouse worker in Nashville, he said. In 1987, there was a fire at his workplace, an electrical fault. He was inside when it started, and he couldn't get out on his own. He paused. Someone went in and pulled him out, through a section of the building that was already burning. Pulled him out and got him to the parking lot and disappeared before the fire trucks arrived, before anyone could get a name. The church was very still. My father told that story for the rest of his life, Dean said. Every detail the same every time. The man was ordinary looking, quiet, wearing a flannel work shirt, blue plaid. He stopped, and my father said the man hummed something while he was pulling him through, couldn't make out the song, just humming, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Ruth's hands tightened in her lap. I don't have proofs, Dean said. I want to be clear about that. I have a name and a description, and 37 years of my father wondering about a man he never got to thank. That's what I have. He looked at Ruth. But I believe it was him. I believe Henry Voss pulled my father out of that fire and walked away without leaving a name, because that was the kind of man he was. And my father lived another 39 years because of it. And I am standing in this church today because of it. Ruth rose from her seat. The movement was slow and deliberate because her body required that. But the intention behind it was immediate and clear. She stood and reached down for the flannel shirt she had placed beside her before walking up to speak, and she walked to Dean Briggs in his pew. She held out the shirt. Dean looked at it, then at her. Something moved across his face that was beyond expression. Something that had been held in place for a long time, held by the ordinary pressure of getting on with things, and that now was released in the specific way that things release when they finally meet what they've been waiting for. He took the shirt from her hands. He held it for a moment, both hands carefully, the way you hold something that has traveled a long distance to reach you. The church was completely silent. The colored light from the east windows lay across them both amber, on Dean's hands blue across Ruth's shoulders, and nobody in the building made a sound. Ruth placed her hand briefly on his arm. Then she returned to her seat. Dean sat down slowly. He held the shirt in his lap for the remainder of the service. The procession to the casket afterward was the longest Oak Ridge Baptist Church had ever seen. Pastor Gregory stood to the side with the specific expression of a man revising his understanding of his own life's work in real time. His wife Patricia, in the second pew, had stopped attempting to manage her composure entirely. They came one by one. Harlan Dietz, who walked to the casket with the heavy, deliberate steps of a large man trying to be gentle, and placed his hand flat on the wood for a moment, and nodded once. Garrett Winslow, who stood longer than anyone before him, and finally laid his palm on the casket and closed his eyes, not performing it for anyone, simply doing it. A 24-year-old making peace with a grief that predated this day by 15 years. Sandra Elkins, who placed a small dried flower on the casket's surface, something she had taken from the inside pocket of her vest, small and pale, pressed flat, as though it had been carried there for a long time. She did not explain it, and no one asked. Everett Webb, who held his hat in both hands the whole way to the front, and could not speak when he reached the casket, but nodded at it with the full sincerity of a man honoring a debt he was never asked to repay. Branson, who had driven from outside Bowling Green on legs that still ached from the treatment, and who stood at the casket for 30 seconds with his eyes closed and his hand pressed over his own chest, not as gesture, but as something more private than that. And then the others, all of them, filing slowly through the church, each one pausing, each one present, until the procession filled the better part of an hour, and the church had been transformed into something that felt like a long collective acknowledgement, a room full of people saying together, without being able to explain exactly why each of them had come, that this life had mattered, that it had been real, that they had witnessed it. Ruth sat in the front pew and watched them come. She did not count them. She simply watched and held the list in her hands and let the morning do what it was doing. Outside afterward, the October sun had come fully out from behind the morning's clouds, and the street was bright with it. Bright on the chrome of 200 motorcycles, and bright on the faces of the riders gathering themselves to leave, talking in small groups, pulling on jackets and helmets. Dean found Ruth near the gate. He had the flannel shirt folded over his arm. He looked at her for a moment, and she understood that he was uncertain whether to keep it or return it. "Keep it," she said before he could speak. He looked at her. He didn't keep things, she said. He passed them along. That was who he was. Dean held the shirt for a moment. Then he nodded with the gravity she had come to recognize as his particular form of deep acknowledgement. He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. "From everyone who came," he said. Ruth took it. The envelope was thick. She could feel through it the density of paper, many layers of it, names upon names. She did not open it there. She held it against her chest, one hand over it. "There's something written on the back of the card inside," Dean said. "Someone wrote it last night. I don't know who." He paused. It seemed right to leave it. Ruth nodded. She would read it at home. She looked out at the street, the motorcycles beginning to move one by one, engines starting in ones and twos, the sound building from the quiet of the morning into the layered rumble she had heard when the taxi first turned onto Route 9. riders pulling onto the road with the unhurried rolling ease of people rejoining a journey, heading back to their own highways and their own lives, carrying with them whatever the morning had given them. Garrett appeared beside Dean. He stood there for a moment, not quite sure what to say. "He sounded like a good man," he said finally, simply, without decoration. Ruth looked at him, at his earnest face, his 24-year-old certainty and uncertainty existing side by side. "He was," she said, "in all the ordinary ways that matter most." Garrett nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else and did not find it, which was fine. Ruth had always believed that the impulse toward kindness, even when it outran the words available to express it, was itself a form of expression. Sandra Elkins appeared, briefly touched Ruth's hand once, and moved toward her bike without speaking. Ruth found she did not need words from Sandra either. The touch was enough, carrying in it everything that the morning had been. The procession of motorcycles lengthened down Route 9. The sound of engines rose and moved south and north toward the highway, the individual sounds braiding into something continuous and receding. The way rivers sound when you're moving away from them, not disappearing all at once but thinning gradually, strand by strand, until the street in front of Oak Ridge Baptist Church was quiet again, and the only sound was the wind moving through the old oak trees along the fence line and the distant fading note of the last engine rounding the hill to the south. Ruth stood at the gate. She stood there a long time, until the last engine was gone. Then she looked down at what was in her hands, the envelope thick with names, Henry's list in her cardigan pocket, and nothing else. The flannel shirt was gone, which was correct, which was exactly right, because Henry had never kept things for himself when they could be passed to someone who needed them more. She opened the envelope. The card inside was covered on every surface with signatures and names and brief notations, some in careful print, some in hurried scrawl, some with short additions that were themselves small acknowledgments. For Henry, for Ruth, thank you for telling us. Names she did not know, would never know, from towns she had not visited, belonging to lives she could not imagine. All of them having traveled through the night for this. All of them having stood on this street in the morning light and bowed their heads for a man with a flannel shirt and a workbench and a list in a nightstand drawer. She turned the card over. On the back, in plain block letters, someone had written, "No one leaves this world alone." Ruth read it once. Then she folded the card carefully and placed it in her pocket beside Henry's list. And she buttoned the top button of the pale blue coat. And she turned and looked at Oak Ridge Baptist Church. Small brick, 100 years old, standing in the October morning exactly as it had always stood. And she took a slow, complete breath of the cool air that smelled of fallen leaves and the last warmth of the year going. She thought about 68 years. She thought about the church social in 1956 and the square dance and the 11 minutes of apology. She thought about the coffee maker and the bent glasses and the tomatoes. She thought about the list in her pocket, 50 years of quiet help, 50 years of showing up for people without needing to be seen. She thought about a burning warehouse in Nashville in 1987, and a man who hummed while he worked, even then, even under the worst conditions, because that was simply who he was. She thought about Dean Briggs holding a flannel shirt in a church pew and the colored light moving across his hands. She looked at the empty street, at the tire marks where 200 motorcycles had stood, at the small flattened patches of grass along the fence where riders had stood in the morning and held their helmets at their sides and bowed their heads. Witnesses, 200 of them, for a man who had never in his life required an audience, but who had, through the accumulated weight of quiet, consistent, unannounced goodness, earned one. Ruth smiled. Not the complicated smile of someone managing their feelings carefully. The simple smile of someone who understands something fully and without remainder. She spoke quietly to the empty street and the oak trees and the clear October sky. "You always did know how to fill a room, Henry." Then she turned from the gate and raised her cane and walked slowly back toward the church, where Pastor Gregory and his wife were waiting, and the morning continued around her, as October mornings do unhurried, complete the light falling clean and even across the old brick and the dry grass and the road that led back to a house on Clover Hill Road, where a coffee maker sat on the counter, and two small indentations remained in the carpet, and a pair of wire-rimmed glasses rested on a nightstand, waiting for no one bearing witness to everything.